Hey people, Wednesday 28. We've been doing a study on faith and looking at how we bear up with faith and the challenge of mountains that sometimes stand in the way of the will of God for our lives. And Jesus tells us that these mountains must move, and it's faith that's going to move these mountains. And we've been looking at the mountain of disappointment with God as being one of the mountains that we have to face. And Jesus says by faith, that mountain, she can be moved. Today I want to suggest to you that one of the dilemmas of a God who seems to be disappointing to us is seen in a God who is supposedly silent. I hear testimonies of people who say, man, God spoke to me. And I'm thinking, yeah, right. What did he say? How did he do it? Did you hear a voice? And I don't want to be a skeptic, and I don't want to be a cynic, but unfortunately I have not had too many of there have been times when I've sensed that God, by his presence and that unction that happens, that God does speak. But man, I wish it happened more often. But I hear people glibly say, the Lord has said to me, and when they say that to me, I'm saying, well, I don't want to argue with God. You win if it's a discussion, because I don't want to argue with God about any of that stuff. But I sometimes am more familiar with a God who seems to be silent, a God who's not always verbal, a God who's not always communicating as I would like to communicate. And I'm disappointed because I say to myself, man, I'm a child of God. I love him. I'm redeemed by him. I know I'm a child of his, and yet why does he keep silent when I so need him just to speak? Now, those are subjective thoughts. And we're standing against subjectivity over the course of the last couple of days, and maybe the next few, to look at a more rational approach to the silence, as we will speak today, of God. Even the psalmist in Psalm 44:23 and verse 24, he says, awake, O Lord, wake up, God. Why do you sleep? Rouse yourself. Why do you hide your face and are silent? Now we read the scriptures and we see how often God is considered silent. You have a look at the time of between Genesis and Exodus. There was 400 years of silence. There was another 400 years of silence between the prophet Malachi and the John the Baptist. And these are long periods of silence. And the people are saying, has God died? Has God moved on? Has God forgotten us? Why is he so silent? Now, if you're like me, I hate silence, always have. From being in a classroom where the silence of the teacher always predicted problems and trouble for me, I've hated silence, and so I will jibber jabber just to keep the voices going and the momentum moving. But God sometimes stands silent. Have a look at Abraham. God made a promise to Abraham that he would have a child. 25 years later, he's still waiting, and that child does appear. But man, he had a long wait. Have a look at the children of Israel in the wilderness. It was only a 10-day walk to the promised land. They had to wait 40 years to get there. And then, even then, when they got there, not everybody went into the land. Now, the rational side of my thinking, I think, so what's so big about God speaking? Because we see, even if he does speak, literally if he speaks, there's no guarantee that I'd listen or act upon what he has said. He did speak. At Mount Sinai, God spoke clearly to the people. Did that help them with obedience? Apparently not. That the voice of God was so overwhelmed by the condition that the people were in and the hardness of their hearts, that even though they heard the voice of God and saw supernatural stuff, they didn't soften their hearts, did it? He spoke at Sinai. He spoke, and he continues to speak now. He speaks to us through the Bible, and we have hardened hearts as well. But then there's that loud voice of God, where God speaks to you through a crisis. Something tragic happens in your family. Something happens, and God suddenly says, man, I need to speak really loud to you right now. And when he does that, all of a sudden we know he's speaking with a very loud voice. But even then, there's no guarantee that we'll respond appropriately. But God does speak. And even sometimes in the silence, the still small voice of God is ready to be heard. I think rationally thinking, sometimes our expectation of what we're going to hear and the format that we're going to hear it in is confusing to us. Do you remember with with Elijah? And Elijah was feeling particularly down. And Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19, God comes to him and says, Elijah, we need to talk. And so he takes him and he goes up to the mountain, and Elijah's waiting for God to speak. And a mighty wind blows across the mountain, and he says, wow, the Lord must be in the wind. But he's not in the wind. A great earthquake happens, and Elijah's there thinking, man, God must be in the spectacular because this earthquake is shaking it up around me. And then a great fire came, and Elijah is disappointed because he doesn't hear God speak in all of the midst of that which is spectacular. But then in the midst of the silence, he turns his ears and he listens, and he hears God speak with that still, small voice. I wonder if you've heard that still, small voice. Sometimes it comes in your conscience. Sometimes it'll come through the whisper of a child. Sometimes it'll come to you through a sermon. Maybe even one of these devotions has said to you, God is speaking very clearly to you. I don't think it's so much sometimes a matter of God not speaking. I think it's a matter of us not listening, because we have a subjective feeling that God must speak in a particular way at a particular time. People, God is a mystery, but he does speak. But sometimes he is silent. Maybe he's silent because there's sin in your life and he can't deal with that. And even Jesus, as he hung on the cross, God turned his face away and was silent, and Jesus couldn't bear it. He said, Father, it's just too much for me to bear. Why have you forsaken me? Because Jesus took upon himself the sin of the entire world. And God could not look upon the sin and turn his eye. Hey people, maybe there's sin in your life that is stopping God from speaking with you. Maybe it's complacency, because God has a way of hiding himself from a casual looker. Maybe you become complacent in your life and you say, well, Lord, at my convenience, will you please speak to me? Maybe you need to look at that. But in a rational way, understand there are periods of silence. God is trying to get your attention. Listen for the still, small voice of God. He does not always speak in the spectacular. I hope you hear the voice of God, because he does speak. And I hope that if there is sin that is keeping God from speaking to you, you be courageous enough to deal with that stuff, because that's a prerequisite for hearing the voice of God. If you need to hear the still small voice of God, maybe you need to take some time out. Just go and sit quietly. There's so much noise around us, so many voices crying for your attention, and you listening to those voices, and they've drowned out the voice of God. Go and take some time and listen carefully. Have a great day.